The glass doors of the Sky Lounge slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. Inside, a cathedral of neon and marble stretched toward the Seoul skyline, smelling of expensive gin and unspoken power. Every diplomat, every high roller, and every predator in the room went silent. Kim Jae-Hyun, the Dragon of Seoul, had arrived. His black, tailored suit was a second skin, concealing the intricate ink that climbed his neck, and his expression was a masterpiece of icy, absolute control. People didn't just move out of his way, they seemed to evaporate. He adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes scanning the room with the surgical precision of a man who owned the very air he breathed. He was the city's most feared architect of violence, or at least, that was the lie he had told the world for years. Then, a soft, amused voice drifted through the crowd. "You're late, Jae-Hyun, and you're standing in my light." The dragon froze. From a velvet lounge chair, a black woman in a fitted red dress stood up. Elliot Monroe didn't curtsy, and she didn't look down. She stood relaxed, a mischievous smile playing on her lips, her braids shimmering under the neon. To the onlookers, she was a non-entity, a high-stakes mediator at best. But as she stepped into his personal space, the chaos versus composure dynamic flipped instantly. "Welcome back to the real world," she whispered, leaning in until her lips almost brushed his ear. She said only one more sentence, a jagged, private truth about the night his empire almost crumbled, and the shame he had buried beneath his tattoos. That was the moment it happened. The iron facade didn't just crack, it shattered. Jae-Hyun's hands, usually steady enough to hold a blade to a throat, began to tremble. His eyes widened, his mouth slightly open, signaling a vulnerability that no one in Seoul had ever seen. Panic gripped his chest, not from a threat of death, but from the raw shock of being seen. "Sir, are you all right?" Victor Kwan, his second in command, stepped forward, hand reaching for his weapon. Jae-Hyun couldn't speak. His breath caught as if he'd been punched. Without a word, he turned abruptly, his boots echoing a frantic, uneven rhythm as he stormed toward the elevators. His guards scrambled, confused, as their boss, the man who feared nothing, brushed past them like a ghost was chasing him. Inside the lounge, Elliot simply tilted her head, watching the elevator doors close. "What on earth?" she murmured, though her eyes sparkled with a surgical calm. "Did I break him already?" That night, Jae-Hyun sat in his penthouse, a glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. The scene replayed in his mind, the red dress, the calm posture, and the shameful, glorious truth she had triggered. For years, he had lived in an emotional deep freeze, hiding the failure that made him feel like half a man. But in one greeting, she had reached through the ice and touched the fire. He slammed the glass down, cracking the marble table. "This isn't real," he hissed. But the sovereignty of his heart had already been compromised. He needed to see her again, not to kill her, but to understand how a non-entity had become the master of the dragon. The following week, Elliot found herself summoned to the Jae-Hyun estate. She walked into his study, a fortress of shadows, to find the most powerful man in the city sitting behind a desk, avoiding her gaze. "You're back, Jae-Hyun," Elliot said, her lips curving into a teasing smile. "I didn't think the great Kim Jae-Hyun was the type to run away from a lady in red." He stiffened, his heartbeat thundering against his ribs. The visible strategist had arrived, and as he finally looked up, he realized the game had changed. He wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the one being rebuilt. The ride to the Jae-Hyun estate was a masterclass in surgical silence. The interior of the obsidian sedan smelled of expensive leather and cold ozone, the city lights of Seoul blurring into long, jagged streaks of neon against the rain-slicked windows. Elliot sat relaxed, her red dress a vibrant wound against the dark upholstery, while Jae-Hyun sat beside her, his posture so tense it seemed he might shatter the glass with a single breath. He didn't look at her. He watched his own reflection, searching for the crack she had created. The gates of the estate didn't just open, they retreated, admitting them into a fortress of shadows and high security sensors. As they stepped into the grand study, a room of dark mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a private forest, the chaos versus composure dynamic deepened. Jae-Hyun turned the moment the heavy doors hissed shut. The dragon of soul was back, but the fire in his eyes was tempered by a desperate, vibrating shock. He slammed a hand onto the desk, the intricate tattoos on his knuckles white with tension. "How?" he rasped, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried the weight of years of suppressed shame. That night, the records were burned, the witnesses were erased. I spent a fortune ensuring that the man I was before that accident remained dead, and then you walk into my light and speak his name as if he's still standing in the room. Elliot didn't flinch. She walked toward the windows, her braids swaying with a rhythmic grace that contrasted sharply with his frantic energy. She looked out at the dark trees, her reflection appearing like a ghost in the glass. "You think power is about what you can erase, Jae-Hyun," she said, her voice a calm, steady blade. "But true intelligence is about what remains in the gaps. You built a cathedral of glass to hide a foundation of sand. I didn't find your secret in a file. I found it in the way you breathe when the sirens go off and the way you clasp your hands to hide the tremor." Jae-Hyun's jaw clenched, his mouth opened slightly as he struggled for air. The vulnerability she had triggered at the gala was back, a psychological pulse that made his authority falter. He realized then that he wasn't just dealing with a mediator, he was dealing with a woman who understood the logic of the abyss. "You're a dangerous variable, Elliot," he whispered, stepping into her space, his shadow looming over her. "I could have you erased. My men are waiting for a single nod." Elliot finally turned, her warm smile undimmed by her threat. She reached out, her fingers hovering inches near the tattooed ink on his neck. "You could, but then you'd be back in the deep freeze waiting for the next person to find the crack. Or you can accept the sovereign debt I'm offering." She leaned in. Her aura of confidence made the massive room feel suddenly smaller. "I will be your strategist. I will rebuild the dragon so the glass never shatters again. But in return, you belong to the game. You stay close, you listen, and you never hide the shame from me again. Consider it your golden handcuffs." Jae-Hyun stared into her kind, firm eyes. His heart thundered, not from fear, but from the terrifying, glorious truth that for the first time in years, he wasn't alone in the dark. He lowered his gaze, his mouth set in a hard line of submission. "The debt is accepted," he muttered. The secret vow was made, and the visible architect had officially taken her throne. The study was a cathedral of shadows, designed to make anyone who entered feel small. Jae-Hyun stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the moonlight catching the sharp lines of his tailored suit and the intricate dark ink that snaked up his neck. The Mafia mask was back in full effect, a facade of icy, unshakable control that had kept the Seoul underworld at bay for a decade. "You think you've won because I've allowed you into my home," Jae-Hyun said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that echoed off the mahogany walls. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowed into predatory slits. "In this house, I am the only architect, Elliot. You are a guest of my curiosity. Nothing more." He began to pace, a rhythmic, tactical movement designed to dominate the space. He spoke of the blood he had spilled and the empires he had crushed, attempting to rebuild the wall of intimidation she had shattered at the gala. It was a performance of visible authority, meant to remind her that he was the dragon and she was merely a witness. Elliot didn't move. She sat in the heavy leather armchair, her red dress a bold splash of defiance. She waited for him to finish his monologue, her expression one of surgical calm. When the silence finally returned, she didn't look at him. She looked at the antique floor safe hidden behind a false panel of books, a panel that was currently slightly ajar. "It's a beautiful performance, Jae-Hyun," she said softly. "But you're overacting. The dragon doesn't need to explain his fire." She stood up and walked toward the safe. Jae-Hyun stiffened, his jaw clenching as he realized where she was heading. She reached into the compartment and pulled out a weathered, leather-bound volume. It wasn't a ledger of accounts or a list of enemies. It was a tactical journal, filled with hand-drawn diagrams of psychological warfare and frantic notes on emotional containment. "You didn't build this empire on fear," Elliot whispered, flipping through the pages. "You built it on the study of it, because you're terrified of your own." She stopped at a page dated years ago where the ink was smudged by what looked like sweat or tears. It detailed the logic of the abyss he had fallen into after the accident. The journal was the roadmap of his shame, the blueprint of the man he was trying so desperately to bury. Jae-Hyun moved then, faster than the eye could follow. He grabbed her wrist, his grip white-knuckled, the Mafia mask cracking in real time. His breath was ragged, his eyes wide and vulnerable. "Put it back," Jae-Hyun rasped, the command stripped of its authority and replaced by a raw, vibrating desperation. "The mask is dead, Jae-Hyun," Elliot said, meeting his gaze with unyielding strength. She placed her other hand over his, her touch warm against his cold skin. "You can't intimidate a woman who has read your soul. Discard the performance. If we're going to survive Victor Kwan and Marcus Hale, I need the man who wrote these pages, not the ghost in the suit." The silence that followed was profound and watchful. Slowly, Jae-Hyun's grip loosened. His shoulders, usually set in a permanent glut of tension, finally slumped. He looked at the journal, then at her, and for the first time, the dragon truly disappeared. "I don't know how to be that man anymore," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I do," Elliot replied. The secret vow was no longer just a debt, it was a transformation. The invisible strategist had found her leverage, and the visible architect was ready to begin the rebuild. The boardroom of the Lee Syndicate was a cathedral of glass and cold ambition perched high above the neon arteries of Seoul. The air was a thick cocktail of expensive tobacco, ozone, and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Jae-Hyun Kim sat at the head of the obsidian table, his posture a masterpiece of sovereign precision, though only Elliot, standing in the shadows behind him, could see the microscopic tension in the way his white-cuffed sleeves met the dark wood. Across from him sat Victor Kwan. Victor was raw emotion dressed in a $3,000 suit, his eyes wide with a predatory hunger as he leaned forward. He wasn't just a lieutenant, he was a challenger sensing a crack in the dragon's armor. "The rumors are like a virus, Jae-Hyun," Victor drawled, his voice a rhythmic, grating noise that filled the profound silence of the room. "They say you fled the Sky Lounge. They say a woman in a red dress broke the ice of the dragon. If you can't control your own nerves at a gala, how can you control the logistics of the port?" Jae-Hyun's jaw tightened. The Mafia mask was beginning to vibrate with the effort of holding back the shame Elliot had unearthed. He began to reach for his water glass, a telltale sign of a parched heart and a wavering heart. Elliot stepped forward, just a fraction. She didn't speak. Instead, she performed a surgical pulse of psychological cues. She placed her hand on the back of Jae-Hyun's chair, her fingers tapping a slow, steady rhythm that mirrored a resting heartbeat. It was the logic of the abyss channeled into a grounding touch. She caught Jae-Hyun's eye in the reflection of the glass tabletop and gave a slow, deliberate blink, the universal signal for de-escalate. Jae-Hyun's hand stopped inches from the glass. He didn't drink. He leaned back, his shoulders relaxing into the weight of her presence. The chaos versus composure dynamic shifted in a heartbeat. He didn't look at Victor with rage. He looked at him with the quiet authority of a man who already knew the outcome of the game. "You're listening to the whispers of ghosts, Victor," Jae-Hyun said, his voice a melodic, chilling vibration. "The Sky Lounge was a triage of a different kind. I left because the business there was finished, just as the business here is about to be." Victor blinked, his aggressive posture faltering. He looked at Elliot, sensing the invisible authority radiating from the woman in the shadows, but he couldn't decode the language she and Jae-Hyun were speaking. Elliot adjusted her posture, standing upright and steady, her eyes locked on Victor's carotid artery. She didn't need a weapon. Her gaze was a sovereign asset that told Victor he was being mapped and measured. She subtly tilted her head toward the door, a silent command for Jae-Hyun to end the meeting while he still held the high ground. "The ports are stable," Jae-Hyun concluded, standing up with a grace that signaled the conversation was over. "If you spend as much time on your manifests as you do on gossip, perhaps your sector wouldn't be lagging. Dismissed." As the victor and the other lieutenants shuffled out in a state of confused submission, Jae-Hyun waited until the heavy glass doors hissed shut. He let out a breath he had been holding for 20 minutes, his hand finally reaching for the water. "You saw the tremor," he muttered, not looking back. "I saw the man who suppressed it," Elliot replied, stepping into the light. "The mask didn't break, Jae-Hyun. It just became a shield." The rain in Seoul didn't just fall, it dismantled the city's light, turning the skyline into a blurred watercolor of blue and gray. Elliot stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jae-Hyun's private library, her reflection ghosting over the glass. The sovereign precision she had displayed in the boardroom wasn't a gift, it was a scar. It was the result of the logic of shadows, a life lived in the margins of international intelligence, where being noticed was a death sentence and being overlooked was the ultimate weapon. Years before the Dragon of Seoul ever crossed her path, Elliot had been a sovereign asset in a different kind of war. Her training hadn't happened in a gym, but in the sterile, high-tension rooms of Langley and the back-alley safe houses of Berlin. She had been taught to view human behavior as a series of predictable algorithms. A twitch of the carotid artery wasn't just nerves, it was a triage pulse signaling a lie. The way a man clasped his hands wasn't just a habit, it was a defensive isolation protocol. She remembered a cold winter in Zurich, shadowed by the visible authority of a crooked diplomat. She had spent 3 weeks as a non-entity, a quiet translator who never raised her voice and never challenged the room. While the elite discussed their logistics of greed, Elliot was mapping the room's psychological architecture. She learned that the most dangerous person in the room is never the one shouting, it's the one holding the silence. This was the surgical precision she now applied to Jae-Hyun. She saw the way his tattoos acted as a Mafia mask, a jagged distraction from the shame that vibrated in his chest. She saw how his icy control was actually a golden cage of his own making. In her past life, she would have used that information to dismantle him. In this life, she was using it to rebuild him. "You're staring at the dark again," Jae-Hyun's voice cut through the silence, a low vibration that vibrated with a new kind of quiet authority. He stepped into the light of the library, his black suit impeccably pressed, but his eyes were searching hers for the visible strategist. "I'm looking at the gaps, Jae-Hyun," Elliot replied, turning away from her reflection. "The shadows are where the truth lives. I spent a decade learning how to breathe in the dark so I could recognize when someone else was suffocating in it." She walked toward him, her red dress of vibrant defiance against the shadows of his library. She wasn't just a mediator, she was the architect of the abyss. She had mastered the logic of shadows so she could lead him out of them. The secret vow they had made wasn't just about syndicate power, it was about the fact that she was the only person in the world who could see the dragon without being blinded by his fire. The safe house was a fortress of minimalism, tucked into the mist-covered foothills of Bukhansan. Inside, the air was still, filtered through high-grade purifiers that hummed with a low, sedative frequency. Jae-Hyun was in the kitchen, his ink-stained hands gripping a porcelain cup as he stared at a wall of security monitors. Lydia Price, his personal assistant for 5 years, was bustling around the periphery, her movements a rhythmic, tactical display of efficiency, organizing files, checking the perimeter sensors, and pouring tea. To anyone else, Lydia was the picture of visible loyalty, but Elliot sat on the velvet sofa, her red dress draped elegantly over the cushions, watching the logic of shadows play out in real time. She wasn't looking at the monitors, she was looking at the way Lydia's thumbs tucked into her palms every time Jae-Hyun mentioned the sovereign debt he owed the mediator. The 5 knives have lost the scent, Jae-Hyun. The digital footprint was scrubbed by Victor Kwan's team an hour ago. We're safe here. Elliot felt the psychological pulse of the room's shift. Lydia had used a redirective language pattern, mentioning Victor Kwan to anchor Jae-Hyun's trust. But as she spoke, Elliot caught a surgical precision micro-expression, a brief one-sided smirk that vanished in less than a fifth of a second. It was the contempt leak, the signature of someone who felt superior because they held a secret power. "Lydia," Elliot said, her voice a calm, steady blade that cut through the silence, "why did you check your watch 3 times in the last minute? The manifest for the morning transport isn't due for another hour." Lydia froze, her hand hovering over a tablet. I have a personal appointment I was checking on, Miss Monroe. Is that a problem?" "It is when your personal appointment matches the tactical window for a high-altitude drone strike," Elliot replied, standing up with a sovereign grace that made the room feel suddenly colder. She looked at Jae-Hyun. "She's the Judas, Jae-Hyun. She's not checking the time, she's checking the countdown." Jae-Hyun's jaw clenched, his eyes widening as the Mafia mask shattered. He looked at Lydia, the woman who had known his shame for years, and saw the truth in the way she finally dropped the professional facade. Her posture shifted from compliant to defensive. Her eyes darted toward the heavy mahogany doors. "The dragon is a dying myth," Lydia hissed, the rhythmic noise of her betrayal finally surfacing. "Victor Kwan offered me a seat at a table that doesn't tremble when a woman in a red dress speaks." Before Jae-Hyun could react, the distant, low-frequency hum of a drone began to vibrate through the glass. Elliot didn't wait for the explosion. She grabbed Jae-Hyun's arm, her surgical calm anchoring him as the first thermal charge hit the outer perimeter. "The Judas kiss is finished. Now we see if the dragon can fight in the dark." The penthouse atop the Lotte World Tower was a fortress of glass, a transparent cage suspended 60 floors above the neon haze of Seoul. Outside, the rain lashed against the reinforced windows, but inside, the air was static and dry. Marcus Hale stood by the grand piano, a silhouette of raw malice dressed in a white linen suit that seemed to glow in the dim emergency lighting. He wasn't alone. 4 of Victor Kwan's 5 knives stood at the perimeter, their weapons raised with the rhythmic, tactical precision of professional killers. Jae-Hyun stood in the center of the vast living area, his hands clasped behind his back to hide the tremor that had returned with a vengeance. Seeing Marcus Hale wasn't just a threat to his wife, it was a direct assault on his shame. Hale was the architect of the accident, the man who had witnessed the dragon reduced to a broken, weeping mess on a cold asphalt road years ago. "You look well, Jae-Hyun," Hale sneered, his voice a grating noise that filled the profound silence of the room. "Tell me, does the phantom pain still keep you awake, or is it just the fear that someone will find out you're nothing but a hollow suit?" Jae-Hyun's breath hitched, his eyes widened, and for a second, the Mafia mask slipped entirely, revealing the ruined king beneath. He looked toward the floor-to-ceiling glass, the height suddenly feeling like the logic of the abyss pulling him down. Elliot stepped into his line of sight. She was a vibrant spark of red in the sterile gray room. She didn't look at Hale, she looked only at Jae-Hyun, her expression a surgical calm that acted as a psychological anchor. "Don't look at the height, Jae-Hyun," Elliot whispered, her voice a melodic vibration that bypassed the panic. "Look at the reflection. He thinks your shame is your weakness because he's the one who gave it to you, but he's wrong. The man who survived that wreckage is the only one in this room who knows how to rebuild from nothing." She reached out and adjusted his lapel, her fingers pressing firmly against his chest, a sovereign touch that grounded him. "Your shame isn't a burden, it's your sovereign asset. It's the proof that you can be broken and still stand. Use it. Show him the dragon isn't a myth you wear, it's the skin you grew back." The shift in Jae-Hyun was visible, the psychological pulse of the room inverted. He didn't try to hide the tremor, he leaned into it, his posture shifting from tense to primed. He looked at Marcus Hale and, for the first time, he didn't see a tormentor. He saw a man who had failed to finish the job. You left a boy in that wreckage, Marcus, but you're looking at the man who climbed out. You're in my house now, and the glass is much thinner than you think. As Jae-Hyun signaled the blackout protocol, the penthouse plunged into darkness. Elliot moved with him, the visible strategist guiding her king through the shadows. The glass house siege had begun, but the roles had changed. The prey was gone, and the architect of the abyss was home. The stretch of highway near the Incheon interchange was a wasteland of salt-crusted asphalt and rusted guardrails, a cathedral of concrete that had haunted Jae-Hyun's nightmares for 3 years. The rain here felt different, colder, sharper, like the memory of shattered windshield glass. Jae-Hyun stood in the center of the lane where his car had once spun out of existence, the spot where the dragon had been reduced to a broken, weeping boy. Behind him, the obsidian SUVs of his personal guard formed a silent, rhythmic, tactical crescent, but they weren't his anchor tonight. That role belonged to the woman standing 100 yards away on the overpass, her red dress a vibrant, defiant spark against the gray sky. Elliot wasn't just watching. She was the visible strategist, her voice a steady, melodic vibration in his earpiece. "The perimeter is set, Jae-Hyun." Elliot's voice was a surgical calm that bypassed his rising panic. "Victor Kwon and Marcus Hale are moving into the funnel. They think they're coming here to finish you at your weakest point. They don't realize you've turned this graveyard into your throne room." Jae-Hyun took a breath, the psychological pulse of the location threatening to pull him back into the abyss. He looked at the scarred guardrail, the physical proof of his failure. For years, this place had represented his shame. But as he heard the distant roar of Victor Kwon's approaching motorcade, he felt the shift Elliot had promised. The shame wasn't a weight anymore. It was the sovereign asset of a man who had already seen the end of the world and survived. "They're crossing the 300-meter mark," Elliot whispered, her fingers dancing across a tactical tablet on the overpass. "Jae-Hyun, the logic of the scalpel dictates that we don't strike the body, we strike the spirit. When they see you standing exactly where you fell, the myth of their power will shatter." The lead car and Kwon's convoy screeched to a halt, the headlights cutting through the mist to illuminate Jae-Hyun. Victor Kwon stepped out, his face twisted in a sneer of raw malice. But as he looked at Jae-Hyun, his expression faltered. He expected to find a man paralyzed by trauma. Instead, he found a visible architect of his own destiny. Jae-Hyun didn't flinch. He didn't hide his hands. He stood with the quiet authority of the dragon, his eyes reflecting the cold, calculated light of the woman on the overpass. "You came back to die where it started," Victor roared, but his voice lacked the rhythmic noise of true confidence. "I came back to show you that the dragon can't be buried," Jae-Hyun replied, his voice a chilling, steady vibration that echoed off the concrete pillars. "The accident didn't break me, Victor. It just stripped away everything that wasn't steel." On Elliot's signal, the blackout protocol was triggered. The highway lights died, and the logic of shadows took over. In the absolute dark, Jae-Hyun moved with surgical precision he had never known before. He wasn't fighting for his life, he was reclaiming his honor. By the time the emergency flares hissed to life, Victor Kwon's men were disarmed, and Marcus Hale was on his knees. The final restoration was complete. Jae-Hyun looked up at the overpass, meeting Elliot's gaze through the rain. The shame was gone, replaced by a sovereign peace. He wasn't a ruined king anymore. He was the man who had walked out of the fire, guided by the woman who knew exactly how to fan the flames. The obsidian SUV came to a halt in front of the private terminal at Incheon, its engine purring with a surgical silence that masked the raw power beneath the hood. Outside, a sleek Gulfstream sat waiting on the tarmac, its turbines beginning to whine, a ticket to a new life, a clean slate, and a bank account heavy enough to buy a dozen identities. Kim Jae-Hyun sat in the back with Elliot, the implied authority of his presence now softened by a profound, watchful grief. He reached into his blazer and pulled out a single black titanium card and a passport with a name she hadn't used in a decade. "Everything is ready, Elliot," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried no demand, only a heavy, honest debt. "The 5 knives are dismantled. Marcus Hale is a memory. You've settled the sovereign debt 10 times over. You can walk onto that plane and never look at a shadow again. You can be the ghost you always wanted to be." Elliot looked at the plane, then at the card. For years, this was the sovereign goal. She had lived the logic of shadows specifically to reach this moment, the exit strategy. She thought about the quiet villas in Tuscany and the anonymity of a beach in Brazil. She thought about the NPC life she had perfected, where no one knew her name and no one triggered her psychological pulse. But as she looked at Jae-Hyun, she didn't see a mafia boss. She saw the man she had rebuilt with surgical precision. She saw the visible architect who only breathed easily when she was in the room. The logic of the abyss had taught her that freedom wasn't just about running away, it was about choosing where to stand. "You're giving me the Queen's Gambit," Elliot whispered, her fingers grazing the titanium card. "A tactical retreat to save the most valuable piece on the board." "I'm giving you the choice I never had." Jae-Hyun's jaw clenched as he forced himself to look away. Elliot felt the psychological pulse of the moment reach its zenith. The game she had played for a decade, the observing, the calculating, the hiding, felt suddenly hollow. She was tired of being the shadow in the corner. She was tired of the logic of shadows that required her to be a ghost. She took the titanium card, but she didn't put it in her bag. Instead, she leaned forward and tapped it against the driver's partition. "Change of plans," she said, her voice a chilling, steady vibration of quiet authority that made the driver instantly stiffen. "We're going back to the estate. There's a manifest for the southern port that needs my signature, and Victor Kwan's remaining assets aren't going to liquidate themselves." Jae-Hyun turned, his eyes widening, his mouth slightly open in a look of total, vulnerable shock. "Elliot, the plane, the life you wanted." "I've changed the game, Jae-Hyun. I've tired of playing in the shadows. I think it's time the dragon had a queen who's not afraid of the light." As the SUV peeled away from the tarmac, leaving the private jet to whistle at the empty sky, the secret vow was finally fulfilled. The invisible strategist was gone. The visible architect had found her partner. And as they drove back towards the heart of Seoul, Elliot Monroe realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding from the fire. She was the one fanning the flames. The skyline of Seoul shimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Kim Group's new headquarters, a sprawling fortress of glass that stood as a testament to a reconstructed empire. Inside the executive penthouse, the air no longer smelled of the cold ozone of fear. It was rich with the scent of sandalwood and the surgical silence of a machine running at peak efficiency. Kim Jae-Hyun sat behind an obsidian desk, his posture a masterclass in quiet authority. The tension that had once made his hands tremble was gone, replaced by a sovereign peace that radiated from him like heat from a controlled flame. He adjusted his cufflinks, no longer a nervous tick, but a deliberate, rhythmic gesture of a man who owned every second of his time. His neck and hand tattoos were still visible, but they no longer function as a mafia mask to hide a ruined king. Instead, they were the visible heritage of a man who had walked through the fire and chosen to stay. Beside him stood Elliot Monroe. She was no longer the invisible strategist or the high-stakes mediator operating from the margins. She wore a tailored suit the color of deep wine, her braids pinned back in a style that projected sovereign grace. She didn't stand behind him, she stood beside him, her presence dominating the room without the need for force. In her hand, she held a digital tablet displaying the logistics of the syndicate, a complex web of trade routes and security protocols that she had personally re-architected. The Southern Port manifests are clear, Jae-Hyun, Elliot said, her voice a melodic vibration that acted as the heartbeat of the office. Victor Kwan's remaining loyalists have been integrated into the new security detail. The logic of the scalpel has been applied. The rot is gone, and the foundation is steel. Jae-Hyun looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a profound, watchful warmth. He didn't see a variable to be managed. He saw the visible architect of his soul. "And the board of directors?" he asked, his voice steady and resonant. "They no longer whisper about the Sky Lounge," Elliot replied with a bold, mischievous smile. "They understand that the dragon didn't break that night. He was simply being forged into something sharper. They don't fear your anger anymore, Jae-Hyun. They fear your silence." A year ago, he had been a man paralyzed by a secret shame, hiding in a golden cage of his own making. Today, he was the absolute head of the city's most powerful syndicate, anchored by the woman who had dared to trigger his darkest truth to save his light. The psychological pulse of their partnership was the new law of the city. Jae-Hyun stood up and walked toward the window, looking out over the empire they had built together. He reached out, and for a moment, his hand rested on the glass, the same glass that had once felt like a cage. Now it was just a vantage point. Elliot joined him, her reflection overlapping his in the transparent divide between their world and the city below. "You saved me from the abyss, Elliot," he murmured, his quiet authority softening into an intimate confession. "I didn't save you. I just reminded you that the dragon is the only one who can rule the fire. We aren't hiding in the shadows anymore, Jae-Hyun. We are the ones who cast them." As the sun set over Seoul, casting a long crimson glow over the visible queen and her king, the secret vow reached its final, unshakable resolution. The shame was a ghost, the dragon was awake, and the architect was finally home. Thanks for watching Boss Hidden Chronicles. If this story pulled you into the shadows of power, secrets, and hidden strength, you're in the right place. Here, we uncover the stories no one dares to tell, where quiet people change everything, and the truth always comes at a cost. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, stay curious, because every boss has a hidden chronicle waiting to be revealed.